So, as you know, last week in Berlin there were a lot of celebrations because of this anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall. And as it happens, Molly was there last week, and she was conducting further interviews for her research project on former East German political activists. So maybe I would first like to ask Molly to tell us a bit about last week in Berlin, about the atmosphere, and what kind of observation did you make about how the fall of the wall is being remembered there?
Okay, well, this is, I think, also a wonderful event to have in this place. I just wanted to start by saying that because I think it's sort of unusual. So the atmosphere in Berlin, well, I guess the thing that I can contrast it with is the 25th anniversary of the fall of the wall. I was also there for that. And my work, I have to say, is with a very particular group of people. They were anti-state activists, and I started interviewing them 28 years ago. I joke and I say it should be called the long conversation, this research. So they are very, very particular people in this general thing. So we'll talk later about that. But in Berlin itself, the 25th anniversary was a far, and the 20th as well, were far, far more, I want to say, celebratory events. There were fireworks at the Brandenburg Tor. There were many, many feelings like you were at a big party almost. The 30th anniversary, and I have to say again, I was in Berlin, so not in other places in Germany. Berlin is, I even wonder if it was anything in other places in Germany. But Berlin, being Berlin, you know, they had more than 200 events. In fact, I brought the little book of all the events that they did throughout. It was actually for a full week. They had, the city of Berlin had 7 exhibitions all around the place. Some of them were panels, talks. Some of them were short films, you know, a series of short films. But the panel discussions in particular were really thoughtful. They were much less, and there was, very importantly, there was no critical moment of huge fireworks and all that. There were, of course, on the night of November the 9th itself, the crowds at the Brandenburg Gate were like you couldn't walk. In fact, I didn't even particularly want to be there. I was going to the Maxim Gorky Theater, which was a very special place to spend that night because of its role in the changes. But so that one night it maybe had some more of that feeling. But I think in general my comment would be that it really did feel different from previous times. And on the 25th anniversary, you might remember they had, the whole wall was lined with these white balloons, and then at one moment they all went up. There was nothing like that now.
Okay. I'll let you comment later if you have some thoughts on this. I would like to further ask Molly, because I know you have this longitudinal research project where you have, I guess the first interviews you made were in 92?
Yeah.
And then you have been following these interviewees, these people, ever since. So you now made some new interviews. So how was that this time? How were the interviews? And what are the aims of your research project overall? Why are you doing this?
Okay. So just to say very briefly and generally, the overall aim of the project is to see how acute political change, really revolution, is remembered by those who played critical role in making it, okay? So it's really looking at the intersection of biography and history and how these run along over time. That's the general project. These interviews were, first of all, with only a subset of people, and also a much shorter interview, or they were supposed to be much shorter interviews. But in fact, I will say that one of the things that led me to really want to do these interviews this time especially was the rise of the far right and the AfD in East Germany. I mean, I was interested in this, and I wondered what they would say about East German identity, which is something we've talked about for almost 3 decades. But it was quite a bit later in my interview schedule, but in some cases, in one, it literally was brought up. I looked at my recording machine. We hadn't even been talking 1 minute before AfD was right there. So this was a really critical topic. We talked a lot about one of the things generally that the celebration, the commemoration of the wall does, is it kind of says we're all alike and there's almost no differences here. I was curious to see if those people who I'd been interviewing all those years felt that. In short, no, they don't feel that. They think we have utterly different biographies. It's as simple as that. But we can talk more about that. I've always been interested in the question of forgiveness, especially in the context of East Germany, where you had all these spies and spied upon, and it took some years for people to actually realize that in some cases their mother or their partner or whoever was reporting on their activities. So I've, as a political psychologist, have been interested in that. I return to that topic. And I'm also very interested in aging, how people, not just in old age, but aging as a lifetime process. So I asked people if they could have imagined themselves 30 years ago leading the lives they were now leading. And this was really a wonderful conversation we had. And then I asked them, okay, so now tell me what you're doing in your mind's eye 10 years from now. What does that look like? So those were the conversations we had. But the biggest passionate thrust of the interviews was very much on the new right, far right.
Yeah,
not new right. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, we will come back to these topics, and I'll now ask Kati. You have just published this book that I showed, Kirkkaankeltaisen Wartburgin kyydissä, which is it's structured as a kind of travelogue where Kati is traveling through former East Germany. I believe you did several trips.
Yes, I did.
And the book is based on interviews, also as in Molly's case, interviews Kati conducted with various people who lived and worked in the GDR, and when you read it, you hear a lot about how they experienced the transition into this new unified Germany, and how the everyday life was in East Germany, and how people were able to negotiate their lives in that society. So, can you maybe give us a bit context how this book came about, and also I'm curious how you chose these people and what kind of people, because we talked about Molly's interviewees are these political activists, so what kind of people are these interviewees you met?
Yes, nice being here with my book today, and my book goes back to the year 90. I was studying 1 year in Bamberg, which was the former West Germany. I was planning to stay longer, but it turned out to be just the 1 year. And when I went to Bamberg, I was a 20-year-old person from Finland, very optimistic, thinking that, of course, big Germany, no problems on getting a flat where to live. But it seemed to be a problem. I was spending my time at the youth hostel there, I think 1 week or 2 weeks, and starting to get a little bit depressed because it didn't show out as shiny as I thought the beginning in Germany. And in the end, it was very good for me that I had to be there in this youth hostel, because I met a woman, a law woman, Grit, who was also searching a flat. And we both were trying to find a one-room flat and didn't find it. So we planned, just by chance there, meeting in the cafe there, as we are here today, that why don't we search a flat together? We found a flat together, and we lived there this 1 year. And what was great was that she was from Leipzig. She was East German. She had just finished her studies in Leipzig as the wall fell. And she had to study 3 more years in the new world, in New Germany. So with her, I got to know her family in Leipzig and other parts of the former East Germany. And at the university in Bamberg, I was mostly with the West German people. The year 90 was in Germany a very interesting time. The happiness of the wall going down was past, and it was really this Ossi-Vessi discussion. And at the university I heard how people were talking about the Aussies buying bananas, and at home I had Grit, who bought bananas almost every day. So I was in between. I was in this grey area as a Finn. I was also, my position was neither or, on no side. And what made a very big influence on me was the mentality of the East German people. I came from Finland. It was 90, so I have lived in Finland the 70s and 80s, and it was a different time here than after that. I thought that the mentality of the East Germans was very close to us Finns. Modesty and a little bit shy people, and it differed from the West German people at that time. And this was the idea what stayed in my mind from that time, from this year. And then I came back to the idea of making some project in East Germany, and I have had contact with Grit after that. And a few years ago she said, if you are planning to do something, you have to hurry, because times are changing and people are changing and everything is changing. So then in year 2014 I went back with my thoughts from back to 90s and started to find people through Grit, first in Leipzig, and then I had another friend that lives in Görlitz, in the border to Poland. So I have these two friends, and then of course through people you get to know people. And so this is the way I get these 30 people. And my main aim was to find people to tell about the very normal life in East Germany, and then after the Berlin Wall in the new Germany.
Yeah, let us talk more about those interviews. I'll now ask Pertti Ahonen. You have studied the history of the Berlin Wall, and you have published this book called Death at the Berlin Wall, which focuses on 12 individuals who died at the wall between the years 1961 and 89, which were the years when the wall was there. So first of all, can you tell us about these people? And also, you obviously you chose this lens of writing about the history of divided Germany. So what does this tell about this history, these individual stories?
Yeah, great, thank you. First of all, thanks for inviting me. It's great to be here. Here's the book. It's an Oxford University hardback, so it only costs about €100. So if you have lots of money, go and buy it. But the short version of the book is that I was kind of trying to do two things. I was interested in really the individual stories of people who died at the wall. There's competing counts of how many people that there were who died, but the most reliable number at the moment is 140 at the Berlin Wall or around it. So I was wanting to focus on particular individuals. These were just regular people who were caught in difficult situations at the wall and died. So one objective was to kind of give them a kind of history in this kind of written form, and come up to it from that kind of micro-historical perspective of the individuals, who they were, where they came from, what happened to them, and also how they were then commemorated or not afterwards. And what's important there is that we all know about people who died escaping from the GDR, or trying to escape, rather. But there were also about 25 East German border guards who died somewhere along the German border, 8 of whom died in Berlin during the Cold War. And these were all in many ways victims of the wall, and in the GDR very important victims. So one interesting aspect that also motivated me here was that the Western victims and the Eastern victims were completely different people. In the GDR, there was a lot of commemoration of these guards, while the people who tried to escape were either ignored or vilified in different ways. And in the West, no one talked about these guards really, and the focus was very much on people trying to escape. So from there, that was the one aspect, those individuals and their stories. But I wanted to link that to broader issues of the competition between East and West Germany, and the kind of legitimacy battle that was constantly going on between them. Which one was the right Germany, the proper Germany, and which one was the bad side, which maybe continued the traditions of the Nazi period. Both sides made these arguments, and on both sides the wall obviously was an important issue. It was explained in different ways, and these different stories of dying and victimhood and suffering at the wall were used in different ways on the two sides. So the bigger aim was to kind of tell the story of the competition between the two states from 61 to 89 by linking these stories or the fates of the individuals to kind of broader processes at the time. So these kind of two levels I was trying to address.
Yes, and at the end of the book, you also talk about the kind of the memory culture in Germany related to this fall of the Berlin Wall. So, okay, it's been 30 years. Germany was unified in 1990, and there's been a lot of talk about this the so-called wall in the head. How tearing down this physical wall was only the first step in this complex process of like trying to unify these two parts of Germany, and often what comes out when you read about East Germans' experiences that they tend to feel that they had less say in this process than the more affluent West Germans, that West Germany brought their institutions and businesses and practices to the East. So let's talk about this. How this memory of the wall has developed since 1990s. You all have kind of been following this. So first, maybe Pertti, you can continue, and you write both in the book both about the court trials related to these deaths at the wall, which are also very illuminating, and then you write about these memorial sites that many of you maybe also know from Berlin, where you can go and look at the remnants of the wall, and you write about all these discussions related to how to commemorate the wall. So can you tell us how this process has kind of, in very groped terms, been?
Yes, thank you. It's a huge question, but I'll try to be very brief. And so I'm going to generalize quite a lot, and my co-panelists may well disagree. But I'd say that there's been kind of two stages, roughly, or three, really. And the first was, first of all, to try to get rid of the wall physically. It was removed very quickly. And then following that, and at the same time with that, there was an emphasis very much on, let's say, the sort of dark sides of the wall. So these deaths, particularly of the people trying to escape, the trials of border guards were linked to that very much, and a portrayal in general of the wall as this problem and a kind of embodiment of maybe even the evil of the East German system, or at least the deep problems within that. But then I'd say certainly by the 20th anniversary of the wall coming down, by 2009 and already a bit before that, there was a change towards a more positive way of trying to remember the wall. It has these dark sides, but you can also portray it and try to remember it as a symbol of a move to democracy from a dictatorship, and as an indication of a peaceful revolution, a people's revolution, a sort of activist that Molly has studied. And this in the German context is of course very important, because previously there were no successful revolutions of that kind, unlike say the French Revolution or something. So I'd say that certainly by the 20th anniversary and since then, the focus then moved towards this kind of emphasis. And for instance, the 2009 anniversary was known as the Festival for Freedom, and these kinds of themes about freedom, peaceful revolution became increasingly strong. Although now, in the 30th anniversary, Molly was there, I wasn't, I only followed it from the media, but I think that emphasis is still there, but there's a kind of much more anxious undertone to it of populism and the rise of right-wing forces and a concern about defending democracy, which I think came across in the speeches and so on quite strongly. So kind of from a more, I guess, negative focus to a more positive and a sort of maybe lessons that you can draw in a positive way. But at the same time, I think a lot of this has been very Western defined. So the early focus certainly very much so on the wall as this problem as seen from the West, on the victims who died at it, and an agenda set very much by the West, and even the opposition figures of the GDR were in some ways rather marginalized, I would say, for a long time, although recently they've been more in the center. which still kind of leaves the sort of regular East German a little bit to the sidelines. And I think that's where some of the problems with the commemoration come from, the arguments that are linked to this peaceful evolution towards democracy, which imply that the GDR was a kind of Unrechtsstat, not a sort of civilized, lawful system, but something, a dictatorship, maybe even totalitarian, which then, for the ordinary East German, often sounds like their whole way of life is being condemned. And that sort of focus on the Alltagsleben, or the daily life in the GDR, is something that's been, I think, rather missing from that. That's enough from me.
Yeah, thanks. That was a very helpful account. So maybe it would be interesting to hear your comments, Molly, because you have precisely studied this, the kind of the perspective of the East Germans. So you have written, and also in your research more generally, you also write about other cases of political transformation or transition. You have written about the relationship between personal life narratives and the collective narratives. And about what I find very interesting is how certain political narratives are more tellable than others in specific contexts. So can you tell us a bit more about your interviews and what you have found with this in mind? And particularly how have the East Germans experienced the transition to unified Germany and then the commemoration politics, or this kind of...
Okay, can I be... slightly disobedient here,
yes, of course.
just comment on something that Pertti said, because to me this is really interesting how you laid that out there. And I want to just say that this very specific group of people, these key political actors who I've been interviewing, have a very particular take on the fall of the wall. And I think we would probably have some really interesting contrasts here, because they were exactly not the people celebrating when it came down, or indeed afterwards. And Bärbel Bohlai, who was the, quote, mother of the revolution, though she hated that phrase, she was asked, what did she do the night of November the 9th, 1989? And she said, I made a stiff drink and I went to bed for 3 days. Okay? And I mean, it is a challenge for people, especially in the West, to understand, well, wait, why did she do that? Presumably that's what she wanted, they wanted the fall of the wall. But in fact, that was not what they were fighting for. And in fact, people have said to me, and still say to me now, the day that the wall came down, as it came down in the way it did, that was the day the revolution died. Okay? So it's a very, and in terms of what kinds of stories are tellable or not, a lot of times people have a hard time really understanding why people felt like that. Sebastian Flugbeil, who was one of my respondents, we had a symposium on the 25th anniversary in London, and he actually, I remember there, he said, there's this story about how the wall was sort of pulled down from the West, but it wasn't pulled down, we pushed. Okay, and this idea about agency and East German agency and what it was that they were fighting for was so important. Now, to try to understand why then, but also now, none of the people I spoke to, not one, was part of the partying scene of celebrating November the 9th. Anyway, they even find the fetishization about November the 9th to be the wrong date. Okay, from their point of view, it's actually October the 9th in Leipzig, actually. Okay, when in fact the government, when there was not to be a violent answer to the demonstrations. Because if you remember, Egon Krenz was the very person who had gone to Tiananmen Square and congratulated them on the response that they had had to the demonstrators cutting them down. So the big thing in East Germany was, if we step out of line, will we meet a Tiananmen solution or not? So for them, there's very different kinds of dates which are framing what happened, and the dates are important because of what they signify. So I think for me, these are questions of the East German activists certainly amongst themselves have that understanding, but it's very, very hard to get that story out, that different story out. Even now, last week we met with the Washington Post Berlin correspondent. She was doing all these stories on the Stasi and East-West, doesn't matter, blah, blah. And we said, look, do you want a different, here's a different take. And she said, you know what? I've got my Mauerfall stories all sorted out now, so we don't really need that. But what we got was a very different kind of story they were looking for, and our story was not about the Stasi as such. It was really a different story about what happens to people who have been living under a dictatorship. What happens to them 30 years later, right? It's a very different, less sensationalist story. And there's not that much interest in the press for that kind of story.
Not in Germany and not outside of Germany? Or?
Yeah. I think in Germany, I don't know, I'd be interested to hear what you guys think. I think in Germany, my own sense, but this is anecdotal, is there's more interest. There's more interest now than there was. And that is, I think, also because of the difficult rupture that's going on in Germany right now in terms of issues that the ADF is addressing, but also everybody, right or left, realizes there are real problems there, as there are across Europe, really. But that the East German response in this particular right-wing way is a very particular thing. And so I think Germans, my sense is they are more interested in a more nuanced story. Even the role of these former activists was different this time than it had been in the past. I think it was, but still, my sense of reading English language press was there was still this story that people wanted. And even on the BBC, even now, right now, there's a daily update on the Stasi escape stories and, all this. So it's clear that is still the hunger they are feeding.
So maybe now it'd be interesting to hear from Kati about your interviews. Like, what did you find as, like, somehow, if you have to give some kind of, you cannot of course summarize, but you can give some interesting sentiments or tendencies that you found in the group that you interviewed, precisely to this question of both the transition to unified Germany, how it's experienced, and also if these people feel that this experience has been somehow represented in Germany, in the media or in other kind of in the cultural sphere, or.
It's a big question, and now when Molly and Pertti has been talking, there are a lot of things going in my head, and one thing is that the people I interviewed was that the time I made it in 2014, the time that was gone, passed after the Berlin Wall, it was long enough so that the people could talk, and I think this was really important. They were free from all the anger and all the pain that it caused in their personal lives, because my stories are from the personal sides. And I think being together has changed a lot. This is one thing where people are very sad. What they said, that how they feel about the wall going away, was that they wanted it to go away because of the freedom of everything, traveling, saying your own thoughts loud. This was one thing that was missing and was very painful for many people. And about Stasi, what Molly said, there were a couple of people who said, it's really great that you don't come with the Stasi, that you are interested in us. Because Stasi was in their lives. It was something. It's of course something that everybody had in their life. One person worked for Stasi, the other one got thrown away from the country because of the Stasi, and it was there. Some people said that we don't have anything to do with this because they didn't know anybody who had problems. And I think the everyday life was the same for everybody. And how they felt after the wall went away, it differed a lot of the way they lived before, because for some people there was no difference, as they said, when it was built. They lived their life as it was before, and for other people it took their grandparents away, it took their cousins away, and they suffered a lot. So I think for those people who didn't realize, as they said, that the wall was there, the difference after it was smaller. But maybe this being together with neighbors, celebrating together, not this fighting amongst others, as they said today. That was one thing for sure what they miss. But they don't miss this not being able to be yourself.
Yeah, what I liked about the book was that because you have these people talk in their own voice, you really get this sense of an ambivalence that they do miss certain aspects of the GDR, but they also realize that all the kind of how the system was restrictive and totalitarian. But it gives this like perspective of a lived life in this, where so maybe
one person said very well, I think, that we didn't want to give East Germany away. We wanted to change something, but we didn't want to take the West German way as it was given to them.
And isn't this also what comes in your interview?
This is identical. I have to say, although the populations, the East Germans we were speaking to are different East Germans, but it's identical.
Yes,
actually, and I'm glad that you raised it as you did, because I need to make the point. Not one single person never wished that the wall did not come down. That would be a complete misrepresentation. Every single person, of course, for the reasons that you've just identified, really appreciates that. But it's then but people, again, what is tellable, people tend to only emphasize all that was gained, but there's also a sense of what was lost. And it's very much along the lines that you say as well. Yeah. And specifically this whole idea of not having been socialized in this Western way to be competitive. So academics, for instance, who I would talk to, they would say, even now, still, 30 years later, if we do something with our East German colleagues, they are on it. They want their name on that publication first. And they're like, oh, sure, that's fine. And they said, but that's actually problematic, because then our young Eastern Germans, or people as they call it with the Eastern biography, they don't have that training from us at home to get your name on that publication, be the first one there, get that grant. It's really, really, really different feeling, and that is still super strong.
Yeah. So this. So what would be? So you were saying that there is maybe a bit more space now for this kind of stories, or in the German, or is there? So how would you tell these stories? And maybe also what Molly's work has been about forgiveness. And okay, we mentioned the Stasi. So it of course is a question that comes up when we talk about the aftermath of the fall of the Berlin Wall. So Molly, you have been talking about political forgiveness and the kind of how the process, if it's somehow successful, or if there can be a political forgiveness, what kind of aspects have to be there. So if you think about this process of unification, where West Germany kind of was leading in a way, how did that then? How was the Stasi, the history of Stasi collaboration then talked about? And maybe Pertti can also comment on this.
I think one of the interesting things is somebody once commented that West Germans wanted to work through East German history. Okay, and this was the problematic dynamic. Okay, because it's actually East Germans who have to work through that. And again, I would be really interested to hear Pertti, because those families who lost people, that's quite a different thing than the ones who actually suffered but survived. The one thing I found in this past week, although it is true that for 28 years I've been really fascinated with this question of Stasi and forgiveness, I have to say that my first interviews ever were 6 weeks after the opening of the of the Stasi archives. And so it was very, very much on people's thoughts, their hearts, etc. But that really is not the case now. I heard a lot last week. Yeah, it's an important topic, but really it's not front and center like it was. By now, first of all, there really aren't new revelations coming out about the Stasi. Even I thought there was one because I'd read about it, and they turned to me, they said, no, that's really old. I don't know why the media just picked up on that. There's not new stuff coming out, and therefore there's not really that much new questions about this. What is the question for many people is how long is too long to wait for someone to acknowledge and apologize for what they have done? And, you know, there's difference of opinion on that. That really is sort of an individual thing. Some people said, you know what, it's too late. They waited too long. That question is long, that train has passed. Other people said, you know what, till your dying day, to your last breath, you can still acknowledge and be that person to own the things you did. And that difference still remains. I asked about the question of forgiveness this time, not because I thought it was so urgent, because my own question in myself was, 30 years later, would it still be such an issue? And the thing is, not so much. Like you said, actually, Kati, the deep hurt, anger, whatever, the rawness was just not there in the same way. It's really like life has moved on.
Do you want to comment on this?
Yeah, another big topic, Stasi. We could have a whole discussion about that, but I think I'd agree largely with what Molly said. Certainly, it doesn't seem like the Stasi aspects are so urgent anymore as they used to be. But it's also worth remembering that the way that United Germany dealt with this issue is actually unique in that in no other state that I can think of course, the whole process was unique because a bigger state essentially took over this smaller state as opposed to the other East European states where it was a kind of process within a particular state. But the access to these documents, that it was the Stasi materials, which are huge, it's an enormous amount of material, and sort of careful legislation that was passed to regulate who could have access to what you could have access, how that information could be used. Of course, it didn't work perfectly. There were problems, there were abuses sometimes. But the impact of it initially was, of course, very big. People could go and read their own files, discover that perhaps in some cases their own husband or whoever had been spying on them. Also, that information could be used in job situations for sort of higher level employees. If they had a Stasi past, the employer could ask the Stasi, the archive, to kind of check on the information, and if it turned out that this person had been an informer or a Stasi employee, that could lead to a dismissal from their employment. And in only a few cases would it lead to kind of criminal trials. You really had to have done something pretty bad, such as these border shootings, for that to happen. But it was a very complex, very complicated, very emotional issue, and often it was also difficult to determine who exactly had been an informer and who not, because of the way in which the Stasi record system was established and the way in which some of the records were destroyed. So there were long disputes about whether particular people had worked for the Stasi or not. I'm thinking, for instance, of Gregor Gysi, who was one of the important leaders of the PDS and then the Die Linke, the kind of successor of the Communist Party, essentially. But I think a lot of this stuff is less urgent now than it used to be, but it's incredibly complex.
Yeah.
Can I just come in? I want to say two things. One is Gregor Gysi was every place in Berlin last week, okay? And you would have thought he was the leading key oppositional activist. And the people who I was speaking to, it made them sick. They literally brought it up themselves. I was at several events where he was there. And it's like, oh my God, you have really, really changed your biography here. Like, okay, so this was one thing which was a funny example, actually. But just the last thing on the Stasi, I would say, because the Germans really, I think, they do memorialization in a very particular and I think quite thoughtful way. And this site of horror, which was the Stasi headquarters, is now the Stasi Museum. And for me, one of the things which was just personally so heartwarming was that it literally, since I've been there last, it's also become the home of the Citizens Movement archives. So all of my materials, all the photographs, the interviews, all the papers, everything, are sitting there at the Stasi headquarters now. These are the people who also really, they would not say this word, but suffered at the hands of the Stasi. And now, for those of us who believe in the importance of historical documentation and what can be done by future generations, it's right there in the heart of it. So that's very powerful.
Yeah. Yeah, so maybe one question that also already came up in what you were saying in the beginning was this question of the rise of the far right in Germany. And so there's also been discussion about how this is linked to this process of unification and the kind of that Eastern and Western Germany are still very much different. So do you have thoughts about this? Like, so,
One or two.
and have your interviews commented on this explicitly? Maybe more than Kati.
Okay, so there are several. It's such a complex thing, but I think one of the things to start out with is, again, you have to say that the media has really picked this up as an East German phenomenon. And it both is and isn't. It's really important to say that the key leaders of the AfD are all from West Germany. All from West Germany. Now, the support on the ground is not. You can't say, a friend of mine said to me, well, so what, those leaders made those East Germans vote for them? I said, no, that's not true. But so that's an important thing to, and they claim to be the party of the East. But it's so cynical, it's not even, it's breathtaking. One of the things that they have done, which is, to me, so strategically clever and so cynical and horrific, is they actually use the language of 1989. So we are the people, right? We are the people and you are not. So it's very much a keeping out who's going to be allowed to be called German. We are the people, also saying they are completing the work of the Wende of 1989. Okay, so what you guys just started, we're really finishing up. This is a pro-German thing. And the people with whom I spoke, one guy just started by saying, this makes me puke. This just makes me puke. It is so cynical. But on the other hand, you have to actually, and obviously the rise of the far right is not a specifically German phenomenon. You know, we look across Europe and we see, but it does have, each country has its own special relationship with it, I think. And you can't deny that in East Germany, which was anyway officially always, its identity was as an anti-fascist state. So one of the things people said is that some of the youth would proclaim their distance from the state by affirming their, whatever, neo-fascist identity. That this was also a way of distancing itself from the state. So there is that aspect, and there's also the aspect, and it's not to valorize the West German part, but this idea, if you officially say that you are an anti-fascist state, well then there's no real reason or impetus to work through your fascist past. But there was a fascist past, and this has not been worked out there. And so, and whereas the discourse around this on the western side of the border is very different, and it always has been. So I think that it has certain challenging aspects, also historically rooted in the East.
Yes, definitely. Do you want to comment on this?
Kati, do you want to?
It was one of my questions, actually, when I made the interviews, that do you still think that there is East and West? And a simple answer is yes. Most of the people I asked said yes, because they represent the generation who lived in the former East Germany, and they have this memory with them all the time. But they also very strongly said that new generations will come, and it already shows Leipzig more than the small town Görlitz, that in the university there are students from everywhere, and it doesn't matter for the younger generations. But one example, there are several teachers among the project, and they say that the salary for the teacher is lower in East Germany. So I think it's also a little bit political, the question.
Yeah, just briefly, I think excellent comments from both my co-panelists already. I'd like to echo what Molly said about this not being just an East German issue. The AfD leadership largely come from West Germany, as you said, and the AfD has significant support in West Germany. For instance, in the Bavarian Landtag elections, they did really well this autumn, not only in the East, but for instance in Bavaria. And it's not just a German issue, like you said, this kind of populist right-wing movements are on the rise everywhere, including in Finland. And I think a lot of, also you have to kind of differentiate when you look at the AfD. There's some really nasty people in the leadership positions and also lower down. Alexander Gauland, who said that the Nazi period was just a, what was the exact quotation, a little pile of bird shit on a sort of glorious stretch of German history. I mean, this is far, far right stuff. But then I think a lot of the support, for instance, in the East, and it's hard to analyze this, but it may come from, it may be more of a protest vote, really. The Linke, the post-communist party, used to kind of embody this, but it doesn't so much anymore. And the AfD often takes stances. For instance, there's been a recent debate about whether to stop coal mining in Germany, and a decision has been made to stop it in the next decades. And this will affect East Germany particularly, and the AfD has taken a very populist stance against this decision, which may well bring its support in areas of East Germany where coal mining is still a pretty important industry. So it's a kind of complex issue, and I don't think you can label all of the AfD supporters as neo-fascists by any means. I think that would be wrong as well.
Yeah.
Thank you. Kiitos.
Yes.